There is a quiet moment in every person's life where they finally realize how often they have stepped away from themselves without even noticing it. How many times they softened their truth just to keep someone else comfortable. How many times they carried weight that was never theirs. And how often they willingly placed their peace on the negotiation table as if it was something the world had the right to bargain for. And in that moment of honest awareness, you begin to see the subtle ways you've been abandoning yourself, not through dramatic decisions or loud betrayals, but through small daily choices that chip away at your sense of worth, little by little, until you look back and hardly recognize the person you once were. And maybe you've felt this shift slowly, the way your heart tightens when you silence your needs, the way your body feels heavier when you agree to something that doesn't sit right with you, the way your mind spirals when you force yourself to stay in spaces that no longer nurture your inner world, and without meaning to, you start living in a state of quiet self-neglect, convincing yourself that it's easier to lose pieces of who you are than to risk losing the people around you. But the truth, the one that rises inside you when everything finally becomes still, is that abandoning yourself never protects anything worth keeping, and sacrificing your peace only teaches the world that your inner stability is optional, flexible, or secondary, when in reality it should be the one thing in your life that is completely untouchable. And so this journey begins not with a loud declaration, but with a deeper recognition that every time you choose silence over honesty, or guilt over boundaries, or exhaustion over rest, you are sending a message to your own soul that it must wait, that its needs are not important enough to honor now, that its truth is something that can be postponed indefinitely. And this episode becomes an invitation, a gentle but firm invitation, to return to yourself in the most honest way possible, to see where you've been shrinking, where you've been tolerating, where you've been negotiating your worth, and to begin rebuilding your inner foundation piece by piece. Noticing the micro moments of self-abandonment. What makes self-abandonment so powerful and so dangerous is that it does not arrive with alarms or warnings. It arrives quietly, disguised as compromise, disguised as kindness, disguised as patience, disguised as being the bigger person, and because these moments appear small, almost harmless, you convince yourself they don't matter, but they do. Because every time you ignore the knot in your stomach when someone crosses a line, every time you laugh at a joke that actually hurt you, every time you say, "It's fine," when your heart feels the opposite, every time you say yes with a heavy chest, every time you give more than you can carry just to avoid disappointing someone, you are taking a step away from yourself, a step that seems insignificant today, but becomes a long distance over time. These micro moments accumulate, shaping your inner world, your confidence, your energy, your identity, and slowly you begin to internalize the belief that your discomfort is acceptable, that your needs are negotiable, that your emotions must wait to be acknowledged, that you must earn your place in relationships by minimizing yourself. But the moment you begin noticing these micro moments, truly noticing them, something profound starts to happen inside you, because awareness is the first act of self-loyalty, the first sign that you are ready to stand with yourself instead of against yourself. You start feeling the subtle shifts in your body when something doesn't feel right. You sense the emotional cost of saying yes out of pressure. You recognize the heaviness that follows self-silencing, and instead of brushing these feelings aside, you begin listening to them, honoring them, understanding that your intuition and your discomfort are not obstacles, but guidance, signals from the deepest part of you that wants to protect your peace. And this awareness doesn't make you colder or harder, it makes you clearer. You begin to understand that peace isn't something you find by avoiding conflict. It's something you create by refusing to abandon yourself, even in the smallest moments. You realize that every micro-act of self-honoring strengthens your relationship with yourself, rebuilding trust where it has been broken, and teaching your heart that it does not have to shrink anymore just to be loved. And maybe this is where a new version of you quietly begins. Your relationship with yourself shapes every other relationship. There comes a moment when you begin to understand that every relationship you struggle with on the outside is in some way a reflection of the relationship you hold with yourself on the inside. And while this realization can feel uncomfortable at first, it is also incredibly liberating because it means that the patterns you've been repeating, the people you've been choosing, the boundaries you've been failing to hold, and the emotional weight you've been carrying are not random events or unfortunate accidents. They are mirrors, showing you how deeply or how lightly you value yourself. And when you look closely, you begin to notice how often your relationships have been shaped not by love or compatibility, but by your willingness to prioritize the needs of others over your own, your fear of losing people, your desire to avoid conflict, and the quiet belief that your worth is something fragile, something that can be taken away if you don't perform, or please, or stay silent. And as this awareness deepens, you start to see how your internal world has quietly dictated the external one. If you struggle to trust yourself, you may find yourself choosing people who reinforce that doubt. If you feel unworthy of consistency, you may tolerate inconsistency as if it were normal. If you believe your emotions are too much, you may stay close to people who dismiss or minimize your feelings. If you carry a fear of abandonment, you may cling to relationships long after they've become harmful. The inner story becomes the outer experience, and without realizing it, your relationships become shaped by the conflicts you avoid, the boundaries you fear to set, the truths you silence, and the parts of yourself you keep hidden. But the most beautiful part of this journey is understanding that the moment you begin healing the relationship you have with yourself, your entire relational world begins to shift in ways that feel both subtle and profound. When you start treating yourself with kindness, you no longer tolerate people who treat you with cruelty. When you start listening to your intuition, you no longer explain away the red flags your heart notices. When you begin honoring your needs, you stop shrinking them to make room for someone else's comfort. When you begin trusting your inner voice, you stop letting others speak over your truth. And when you begin valuing your peace, you no longer allow anyone, no matter who they are, to disturb it without consequence. You start noticing who energizes you and who drains you, who respects your boundaries and who tests them, who shows up consistently and who only appears when they need something, who speaks to you with honesty and who manipulates your emotions through guilt or fear. And instead of rationalizing their behavior, you begin responding to it. You create distance where once you tolerated chaos. You protect yourself where once you apologized for doing so. You speak your truth where once you swallowed it. And you walk away from situations that once held you hostage simply because you were afraid of being alone. And something else happens, something quiet but powerful. The relationships that remain in your life begin to improve, deepen, and stabilize because they are no longer built on your self-abandonment, but on mutual respect, mutual presence, and mutual effort. You realize that healthy relationships don't require you to sacrifice your identity, your peace, or your emotional well-being. They require you to stand in your truth fully and allow others to meet you there. Before this shift becomes your new way of being, you may feel resistance. Resistance from old patterns, from old fears, from the version of you who believed that love must be earned through self-sacrifice. But with each moment, you choose yourself. That resistance weakens, and a new foundation begins to form. A foundation built on clarity, self-worth, and emotional maturity. And maybe, as you strengthen the relationship you have with yourself, you'll begin to understand that the world around you was waiting for you to come home to yourself all along. Silence isn't peace if it costs your voice. There is a kind of silence that heals you, a silence that feels like soft air settling over a restless mind, a silence that brings clarity, perspective, and emotional grounding. But there is another kind of silence, one that slowly dismantles you from the inside. The silence you choose not because you are calm, but because you are afraid of what will happen if you speak, afraid that your truth will be dismissed, your feelings minimized, your needs labeled as inconvenience. And this kind of silence is not peace at all. It is a quiet form of self-abandonment that makes you smaller each time you choose it over your own voice. And what makes this pattern so heavy is that you convince yourself that keeping quiet is the mature thing to do, that avoiding conflict protects the relationship, that swallowing your discomfort is easier than facing the discomfort of someone else. But over time, this silence starts to reshape who you are, slowly eroding the parts of you that once felt alive, expressive, deserving of being heard. You begin noticing that you hesitate before speaking, that you rehearse conversations in your mind to make them sound less offensive, that you're constantly scanning the emotional temperature of the room before sharing even the smallest truth, that you choose harmony even when it costs you honesty, that you withhold your disappointment because you're afraid of how it will be received, and that your internal world becomes filled with unspoken sentences, unshed tears, unmet needs, all quietly stored in the spaces where your voice used to live. And as the silence grows, so does the distance between who you are and who you pretend to be. The tragedy of this kind of silence is that it convinces you you're keeping the peace. But what you're actually keeping is tension, hidden tension inside your chest, unspoken tension between you and the truth of your own experience. Emotional tension that eventually becomes resentment, exhaustion, and emotional numbness. Because peace is not the absence of sound, it is the presence of honesty, clarity, and mutual respect. When silence replaces truth, peace becomes impossible, connection becomes superficial, and love becomes unbalanced. But the moment you begin reclaiming your voice, not through shouting, not through anger, but through calm, grounded honesty, you begin to realize that the relationships meant for you will not collapse when you express your needs. They will grow. The people who truly care will not punish you for speaking. They will listen. And the environments that are healthy will not require your silence to remain stable. They will welcome your truth as part of the connection. Reclaiming your voice starts with small moments, choosing to say, "That hurt," choosing to say, "I need more clarity," choosing to say, "This doesn't feel right," choosing to say, "I'm not comfortable with this," choosing to say, "I deserve to be spoken to with respect," choosing to say no without guilt. And each time you speak, even if your voice trembles, you repair the bond between you and yourself, the bond that silence slowly damaged. And something beautiful begins to happen when you stop silencing yourself. You begin to feel lighter, clearer, and more rooted in your own identity. You begin to trust yourself again. You begin to understand that your feelings are not threats, your needs are not burdens, and your voice is not too much. It is exactly enough. And as you step into your truth with more confidence, you will start attracting people who value that truth, who meet you with openness rather than defensiveness, who see your honesty not as confrontation, but as connection. And maybe this is the moment you finally understand that peace without a voice is not peace. It is quiet suffering, and you deserve more than that. Over-explaining is a sign you don't feel safe. There is a particular exhaustion that settles into your body when you find yourself constantly explaining, clarifying, defending, or softening your truth just to be understood. An exhaustion that doesn't come from the words you speak, but from the deeper fear underneath them. The fear that if you don't explain yourself perfectly, you will be dismissed, misunderstood, judged, or rejected. And this fear reveals something far more important than the explanation itself. It reveals that you do not feel emotionally safe with the person in front of you. Because in spaces where you feel valued, respected, and heard, you don't need to justify your feelings like arguments in a courtroom. You don't need to defend your boundaries like they are accusations. You don't need to repeat yourself in different tones, hoping the other person will finally understand. You simply speak, and your words are allowed to exist without interrogation. And when you look back, you begin to notice how often over-explaining has been a quiet survival strategy, something you learned in environments where your emotions were questioned, where your needs were treated as inconveniences, where your mistakes were magnified, where your feelings were labeled dramatic or irrational, where your boundaries were seen as disrespect. You may have learned early in life that the only way to be acceptable was to make yourself easy to understand, easy to forgive, easy to handle, even if it meant shrinking yourself, even if it meant doubting your own perspective, even if it meant carrying the emotional responsibility for how others reacted. And without realizing it, you began to treat your own truth as something that needed permission to exist. But the moment you start to see this pattern for what it truly is, a lack of emotional safety, something inside you begins to shift. You realize that your worth is not dependent on your ability to explain yourself clearly enough. You realize that your feelings are not essays to be defended. You realize that a boundary does not become more valid just because you explain it with perfect logic. You realize that the right people do not need a paragraph to accept what a sentence can already express. And slowly, you begin reclaiming the emotional space you've been giving away through your explanations. The healing begins in small, subtle acts. You say, "I don't feel comfortable with this," and you stop there. You say, "I need space," and you let the sentence stand without attaching a full lecture to make it sound reasonable. You say, "This hurt me," without providing a detailed timeline to justify why. You begin trusting that your truth is enough simply because it is yours, not because you packaged it perfectly. And as you do this, you start to attract relationships where your truth is met with understanding rather than interrogation, where your boundaries are seen as normal rather than confrontational, where your needs are acknowledged rather than dismissed. And something internal begins to repair itself. The sense of self-trust that you lost when you were taught to doubt your own perceptions. You begin to feel safer within yourself. You begin to speak from a place of clarity rather than fear. You begin to realize that the spaces where you feel small, defensive, or overly apologetic are not spaces where your heart can thrive. Emotional safety is not a luxury. It is the soil in which real connection grows, and any relationship that requires you to explain your worth repeatedly is one that forces you to abandon yourself in pieces. As this truth settles, you begin to understand that over-explaining is not a personality trait. It is a coping mechanism you developed when you didn't feel seen. And now that you see it clearly, you're finally free to let it go. And maybe this is the moment you begin speaking not to be understood, but because you finally understand yourself. Choosing people who don't choose you. There is a quiet ache that settles deep inside you when you keep choosing people who never choose you back in the same way. An ache that doesn't erupt suddenly but grows slowly, almost gently, like a soft pressure beneath the heart, building each time you show up for someone who only shows up when it benefits them. Each time you offer your presence to someone who treats it as an afterthought. Each time you invest emotionally in a connection where your effort is the only thing keeping it alive. And what makes this kind of pain so difficult is that it comes wrapped in hope. Hope that they will notice your loyalty. Hope that they will match your effort. Hope that they will value your consistency. Hope that they will finally see how deeply you care. And yet the more you hope, the more invisible you become to them and to yourself. You may tell yourself that your patience is a virtue, that your understanding is love, that your generosity is kindness, but with time, you begin to realize that you are not being patient. You are waiting for someone to change. You are not being understanding. You are rationalizing neglect. You are not being generous. You are carrying a connection that was never reciprocal. And as you continue choosing someone who doesn't choose you, your internal world begins to shift in subtle but harmful ways. Your self-worth becomes tied to their inconsistency. Your confidence becomes tied to their attention. Your emotional stability becomes tied to their presence or absence. And, without meaning to, you start defining yourself through the eyes of someone who never truly saw you. But there comes a moment, a deep, reflective moment, when the truth becomes impossible to ignore. You feel the emotional weight of your own effort. You feel the loneliness that exists even when they are physically present. You feel the imbalance so clearly that it becomes a form of emotional exhaustion. And in that moment, you understand that choosing someone who doesn't choose you is a form of self-abandonment, because love is not meant to be earned through suffering, and your value is not meant to be proven through endurance. The healing begins when you finally allow yourself to see the situation without the filter of hope, when you stop holding on to potential and start acknowledging reality. When you stop believing that your continued effort will inspire someone to change, and you start accepting that your presence deserves to be met with presence, your affection deserves to be met with affection, your loyalty deserves to be met with loyalty. You begin understanding that relationships are not maintained through one person's determination. They are nurtured through two hearts that choose each other willingly. And as this awareness deepens, something powerful happens inside you. The weight you've been carrying begins to lift, not because the other person changed, but because you finally shifted the responsibility back to where it belongs. You stop chasing, you stop bending, you stop proving, you stop shrinking your needs to keep them comfortable. You stop offering your heart to someone who only offers you fragments of theirs. And slowly, you begin choosing yourself. Not out of pride, but out of clarity. Not out of bitterness, but out of self-respect. And as you step back from the people who don't choose you, you create space for people who will, people who value your presence, who reciprocate your effort, who hear your silence, who feel your absence, who honor your heart without making you ask for the bare minimum. You begin to realize that being alone is not the worst outcome. Being misaligned, unseen, and emotionally undernourished is far worse. And maybe this is the moment you finally understand that choosing yourself is not a punishment to others. It is the freedom your heart has been longing for. Peace requires boundaries, not apologies. There comes a time when you begin to understand that peace is not something you stumble into by accident, nor something that arrives simply because you wish for calmer days or gentler relationships. Peace is something you build, intentionally and deliberately, through the boundaries you set, the limits you honor, and the lines you refuse to let others cross, even if those people are close to you, even if the world expects you to accept behaviors that disturb your inner world. And as this awareness grows inside you, you begin to realize that every moment you apologized for setting a boundary, every moment you softened your no to make someone else feel better, every moment you stretched yourself beyond what your heart could carry just to avoid upsetting another person, you were not being kind, you were sacrificing your peace. And peace sacrificed becomes resentment, exhaustion, and emotional instability. You start to notice how deeply conditioned you've been to believe that protecting your well-being is selfish. How many times you said, "It's okay," when it wasn't. How often you tolerated what made you uncomfortable just to maintain an illusion of harmony. How frequently you allowed disrespect to pass without confronting it because you didn't want to seem dramatic or difficult, and how many times you apologized for simply taking care of yourself. Apologizing for needing space, for setting limits, for expressing discomfort, for choosing distance, for wanting respect, for insisting on clarity. And without realizing it, those apologies slowly taught people that your boundaries were negotiable, fragile, flexible, something they could push against until you eventually gave up and went back to old patterns. But peace, real peace, cannot grow in a life where you apologize for honoring yourself. Peace grows where boundaries are clear and steady, where you protect your emotional space without feeling guilty, where you no longer allow people to use your kindness as an entry point to your exhaustion. And the moment you begin giving yourself permission to set boundaries without guilt, something profound begins to shift inside you. Your voice becomes steadier, your decisions become cleaner, your relationships become clearer, and you begin recognizing the difference between people who respect your boundaries and people who benefit from you not having any. A boundary is not a wall, it is a doorway that determines who enters your life and how they show up once they do. A boundary is not rejection, it is clarity. A boundary is not punishment, it is protection. And when someone gets upset because you set a boundary, it is not a sign that you did something wrong. It is a sign that they were benefiting from your lack of one. Boundaries filter out chaos, confusion, manipulation, and disrespect, leaving room only for relationships built on mutual respect, emotional maturity, and genuine presence. And as you strengthen your boundaries, you begin to feel a kind of lightness you may not have felt in years. The lightness of knowing that your peace is safe with you, that you no longer give people the power to dictate the state of your inner world, that you can love people without losing yourself in them, that you can stay connected without collapsing your needs, that you can be kind without being consumed. You begin to understand that your responsibility is not to keep everyone happy. Your responsibility is to keep yourself whole. And maybe this is the moment you finally realize that peace is not something you wait for. Peace is something you protect, and the way you protect it is through boundaries that require no apology. Stop giving chances to people who hurt you repeatedly. There comes a point in your life when you begin to understand that forgiveness, while noble and beautiful and necessary for your own emotional freedom, can easily become a doorway through which people who have no intention of changing walk in and out of your life as they please, taking what they want, giving little in return, and leaving you to carry the emotional consequences of their behavior. And what makes this cycle so painful is that you don't keep giving them chances because you're weak or unaware. You give them chances because you genuinely hope they'll finally treat you the way you've been treating them, because you believe in their potential more than their patterns, because you hold on to the idea of who they could be rather than accepting who they consistently are. But with every chance you give, the wound deepens a little more, not from the act itself, but from the message you quietly send to your own heart. The message that you are willing to tolerate what hurts you simply because you don't want to lose someone. You may find yourself in a cycle of emotional déjà vu, where the apologies always sound sincere, where the promises always feel convincing, where the temporary change gives you just enough hope to stay invested. But the behavior inevitably circles back to the same hurtful patterns you tried to rationalize or excuse. And over time, this repetition starts to wear you down from the inside, draining your energy, dimming your confidence, weakening your boundaries, and making you feel responsible for someone else's inability to honor your worth. The heartbreaking part is that you might begin to believe that enduring the pain is somehow a sign of loyalty, that your resilience is proof of love, that your emotional endurance is what keeps the connection alive, when in truth, all it does is keep you tied to a version of the relationship that only hurts you. But healing begins the moment you realize that someone who truly cares about your well-being does not put you in a position to be hurt the same way twice, let alone over and over again. People can make mistakes, that is human, but patterns reveal truth. And when someone chooses the same behavior repeatedly, when they disregard your feelings, ignore your boundaries, exploit your forgiveness, and return to the same actions they promised to change, you are no longer dealing with mistakes. You are dealing with choices. And those choices say far more than the apologies ever could. The shift happens the moment you decide that your heart is not a place for repeated harm, that your emotional world deserves protection instead of explanation, that you are not obligated to remain available to someone who keeps wounding you just because you care. You begin to understand that walking away is not an act of anger. It is an act of self-respect, a declaration that your well-being matters, that your peace matters, that your inner world is not a playground for someone else's instability. You start recognizing that giving someone endless chances does not help them grow. It simply gives them permission to remain the same. And as you pull back, as you reclaim your space, as you step into the version of yourself who no longer entertains repeated harm disguised as love, you begin to feel something inside you come back to life. Your clarity, your confidence, your self-trust. You realize that loss is not always a loss. Sometimes it is the beginning of emotional freedom. You understand that choosing yourself does not make you cold, it makes you whole. You start seeing that you can wish someone healing from afar without sacrificing your own healing up close. And maybe this is the moment you finally understand that the people who are meant to stay in your life will not require endless chances. They will require honest conversation, mutual respect, and the willingness to grow alongside you rather than at your expense. Emotional availability starts with you. There comes a moment when you begin to see that emotional availability is not simply about having the capacity to love someone or care for them or show up when they need you, but about having the willingness and the courage to be present with yourself first, to sit with your own emotions without running, to hear your own truth without silencing it, to face your own wounds without pretending they are smaller than they are, because the deepest irony is that people often say they want connection, intimacy, closeness, vulnerability, yet they avoid the very process required to build it, being emotionally available to themselves. And when you are disconnected from your own emotional world, when you don't know what you're feeling, when you dismiss your own pain, when you rush through your discomfort, when you numb your loneliness, when you silence your needs before anyone else has the chance to, you inadvertently make yourself unavailable not only to others, but to the version of yourself that desperately needs your presence. You may not realize it, But emotional unavailability is often learned in silence, learned from growing up in environments where feelings were dismissed, where expressing yourself felt unsafe, where vulnerability was punished or mocked, where strength meant suppression, and where you began to associate emotional expression with weakness rather than honesty. And without noticing, you carried those lessons into adulthood, avoiding hard conversations, distracting yourself when you feel too much, brushing off your sadness with logic, pretending anger doesn't hurt, laughing in moments that feel too vulnerable, delaying healing because healing requires stillness, and stillness requires courage. But what happens next is even more subtle, because when you are emotionally unavailable to yourself, you unconsciously gravitate toward people who are emotionally unavailable to you. You attract relationships where depth is missing, where clarity is missing, where presence is inconsistent, where intimacy feels unsafe, where connection is complicated, because on some level, the absence of emotional intimacy feels familiar. It's not that you want shallow relationships. It's that you've never learned how to hold yourself deeply enough to model something different. And so you repeat the pattern. You offer emotional depth to people who cannot reciprocate. You choose those who keep you guessing. You tolerate emotional distance disguised as mystery. And you confuse intensity with intimacy, because you've never experienced stability long enough to recognize what real connection feels like. But everything begins to change the moment you turn inward, gently, quietly, and begin allowing yourself to feel again, without judgment, without rushing, without shame. You begin to sit with your emotions instead of escaping them. You begin to listen to your discomfort instead of silencing it. You begin to ask yourself what you truly want instead of settling for what you're given. And in that moment, you start learning the language of your own heart. A language you were never taught, but were always meant to speak. As you grow emotionally available to yourself, your relationships begin to shift in profound ways. You start recognizing emotional inconsistency immediately. You stop romanticizing emotionally distant people. You no longer become attached to potential. You no longer feel drawn to relationships where you must earn affection. You stop trying to repair connections that were never built with emotional presence in the first place. And instead, you begin seeking and choosing people who meet you where you are, who understand transparency, who prioritize clarity, who value depth, who communicate openly, who are not intimidated by vulnerability, but embrace it as the natural language of connection. You begin to realize that emotional availability isn't about being open with everyone. It's about being honest with yourself first, because the relationship you have with yourself determines the emotional quality of every connection you enter. When you are available to your own emotions, you no longer abandon your needs to keep someone else comfortable. You no longer confuse love with intensity, and you no longer tolerate relationships where emotional closeness is something you must beg for. And maybe this is the moment when you begin to understand that emotional availability is not something you wait for someone else to give you. It is something you cultivate within yourself. And once you do, the relationships that match your depth will naturally find their way into your life. Rebuilding self-trust through small commitments. There comes a moment in your journey when you begin to realize that the greatest wound you carry is not the disappointment others left in your life, nor the betrayals you endured, nor the love you gave without receiving it back. The deepest wound is the quiet fracture in your relationship with yourself, the subtle break that occurred each time you made a promise to your own heart and then abandoned it the moment someone else needed you. The moment life became overwhelming, or the moment fear convinced you that you weren't capable of following through. And with time, this fracture becomes more than a feeling. It becomes a pattern, a soft but persistent erosion of self-trust. Because every time you told yourself you would rest but pushed yourself instead, every time you said you were done with a situation but returned out of habit, every time you planned to protect your boundaries but collapsed them under pressure, you taught your inner self a painful lesson. My words to myself are not reliable, and perhaps this is why rebuilding self-trust feels so heavy. Not because it is impossible, but because it requires you to confront the ways you have been abandoning yourself quietly, politely, consistently. Not through dramatic failures, but through small daily decisions that communicated to your inner world that other people's needs mattered more than your healing, that urgency mattered more than rest, that pleasing mattered more than emotional clarity, and that your own promises were optional. Yet the truth is that self-trust does not crumble in one moment, and it does not rebuild in one moment. It is a slow, steady relationship that must be nurtured with gentleness, honesty, and patience. And so the healing begins in the smallest acts, acts that feel almost too simple to matter, yet they matter more than anything else. You wake up and choose one small promise you will not break. You tell yourself you will drink water before you touch your phone, and you honor that. You tell yourself you will step outside for 5 minutes, and you honor that. You tell yourself you will journal 1 sentence, stretch for 2 minutes, breathe deeply 3 times, and you honor that. Because the goal is not perfection, the goal is to show your inner self that your words finally mean something again. And with each small commitment you keep, you feel something inside you soften, a sense of safety, a sense of groundedness, a sense of being held by your own presence rather than abandoned by it. Over time, these small acts of self-loyalty accumulate, becoming a new foundation for your identity. You begin trusting your decisions more. You begin speaking your truth without rehearsing it. You begin setting boundaries without guilt. You begin recognizing the subtle difference between what drains you and what nourishes you. You begin choosing environments that reflect your healed self rather than your wounded self. And slowly, almost without noticing, you begin to feel like someone you can rely on, someone stable, someone consistent, someone dependable, someone who shows up even when it's inconvenient, someone who honors the connection between intention and action. And the most beautiful part of rebuilding self-trust is realizing that you no longer need external validation to feel secure, because your security comes from the quiet, steady commitment you cultivate within. You stop looking outward for reassurance. You stop needing someone to tell you who you are. You stop losing yourself in people who cannot see your worth, because your foundation is no longer built on the shifting ground of other people's opinions. It is built on the solid ground of your own loyalty. And maybe this is the moment where you understand that every small promise you keep to yourself is not just a task completed, it is a message to your heart that says, I am here, I am listening, and I will not abandon you again. Your peace is not negotiable, choosing yourself without guilt. There comes a moment, not loud, not dramatic, not surrounded by fireworks or big realizations, but a quiet, unmistakable moment when you finally understand that your peace is the most valuable thing you possess, the foundation upon which your clarity, your emotional stability, your confidence, your relationships, your decisions, and your entire well-being rest, and that every time you bend your boundaries to keep someone comfortable, every time you silence your truth to avoid conflict, every time you carry emotional weight that wasn't yours to begin with, every time you tolerate behavior that chips away at your sense of worth, you are not being loving or patient or understanding. You are negotiating your peace, piece by piece, until you barely recognize the calmness you once had inside you. And this realization does not arrive with anger. It arrives with a kind of softness, a gentle sadness for the version of you who thought peace was something the world could grant or take away, rather than something you were meant to protect from within. You begin to see how often you allowed your inner world to be shaped by external pressures, by people who demanded more than they gave, by environments that drained your energy, by relationships where clarity was missing, by expectations that suffocated your authenticity, by the unconscious belief that your value depended on how much you could absorb without breaking. And as you look back, you begin to understand that the moments where you lost yourself were not caused by loud betrayals or obvious cruelty, but by the slow erosion of your peace, the tiny compromises, the ignored discomforts, the boundaries apologized for, the silence chosen over truth, the tolerance given where distance was needed. But something shifts the moment you choose yourself without guilt, the moment you decide that protecting your peace is not selfish but sacred, not rude but necessary, not avoidance but wisdom. You begin to speak your truth with a quiet confidence that does not seek permission. You begin to walk away from situations that disturb your emotional balance, not because you don't care, but because you finally care about yourself. You begin to prioritize rest, clarity, and emotional stability over proving your loyalty to people who have not proven theirs. You begin to understand that you can love someone and still set boundaries. You can care and still create distance. You can forgive and still choose not to re-enter the same emotional storm. And as you strengthen this inner commitment, you start realizing that choosing yourself is not the opposite of love. It is the truest expression of self-respect, the foundation upon which healthy love is built. You stop explaining your boundaries as if they are negotiable terms. You stop allowing guilt to manipulate your decisions. You stop sacrificing your inner world to maintain connections that were never supporting your growth. Instead, you begin building a life where your peace is the standard, not the exception. A life where every relationship is filtered through the question, does this nourish me or exhaust me? A life where you are no longer available for chaos, mixed signals, emotional games, or people who require you to shrink in order to keep them close. And as you move into this new chapter with more clarity, more strength, and more loyalty to yourself, you will begin to see that nothing you lose by protecting your peace is ever truly a loss. People who leave when you choose yourself were never meant for the version of you who is becoming more grounded, more aware, more whole. What remains, what grows, what enters your life from this point forward will align with your truth, not your wounds. And maybe this is the moment you finally understand that choosing yourself without guilt isn't about closing the door on others. It's about opening the door to the life you were always meant to live, a life where your peace is not a privilege, not a request, not a negotiation, but a non-negotiable birthright you protect with quiet, unwavering strength. There is something profoundly grounding about reaching the end of a journey like this, because as you move through each reflection and each truth, you begin to sense a quiet shift inside yourself, not a loud transformation or a sudden revelation, but a slow, deep rearranging of the way you see your worth, the way you relate to your boundaries, the way you protect your emotional world, and the way you choose the relationships that deserve space in your life. And perhaps for the first time, you start to understand that everything you've tolerated, everything you've forgiven without resolution, everything you've held on to out of fear rather than love, everything you've negotiated at the expense of your own well-being has been shaping the story of your life more than you realized, teaching you where you abandoned yourself and where you are finally ready to return home to who you truly are. You begin to feel the weight of your own patterns, the moments you silenced your truth to keep someone else comfortable, the times you overgave in relationships that gave you so little, the days you woke up carrying emotional responsibilities that never belonged to you, the nights you replayed conversations in your mind, trying to understand what went wrong, when the real issue was that you stayed too long in spaces that could not hold you. And as each memory rises, you don't feel shame. You feel recognition, a gentle acknowledgement that you did what you knew how to do with the emotional tools you had at the time. And now you're learning something deeper, something truer, something that will shape the rest of your life. That your peace is not something the world gets to earn. It is something you choose to protect. And in that protection, you begin reclaiming all the parts of yourself you left scattered across years of compromise. The voice you silenced, the boundaries you softened, the needs you ignored, the emotions you pushed aside. You gather them slowly, like pieces of a puzzle you finally have the patience to complete. And as you place each piece back where it belongs, you begin to recognize the person staring back at you. Someone stronger than the version who once tolerated what hurt. Someone wiser than the version who once confused endurance with love. Someone calmer than the version who once reacted to every disruption. Someone who finally understands that self-abandonment is no longer an option. And as this understanding settles into the center of your being, you start to sense a new kind of clarity. The clarity that comes when you realize that peace is not found in the absence of difficulty, but in the presence of boundaries. Not in the perfection of others, but in the honesty of yourself. Not in the approval of the world, but in the alignment of your own heart. You begin to trust yourself again. You begin to treat yourself with the gentleness you once reserved for everyone else. You begin to show up for yourself in a way you've never done before. And slowly, almost without noticing, you begin to feel whole. So as you step forward from this moment, carry with you the truth that nothing in your life will ever feel stable or fulfilling until you learn to stay loyal to yourself first. Loyal to your peace, loyal to your truth, loyal to your boundaries, loyal to your emotional well-being, loyal to the version of you that is still unfolding and deserves to be protected. When you choose yourself without guilt, the world around you begins to shift in ways that feel right, aligned, peaceful, and deeply human. And maybe this is the beginning of a new chapter in your life, one where you no longer chase acceptance, no longer tolerate chaos, no longer abandon yourself in the name of love. Instead, you stand calmly, firmly, fully in who you are. And from that place, everything else begins to fall into place exactly as it should.